You found the receipt in his jacket pocket on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, you were sitting across from him in a boardroom he didn't know you controlled. That's how it started. Not with screaming. Not with tears splattered on a kitchen floor. It started with a small, paper receipt from a jewelry store you'd never bought anything from. Folded into fourths, tucked behind his employee badge like it belonged there. You are Verity. You are 58 years old. You have been married to Roscoe for 26 years. And for 22 of those years, you built something he never bothered to ask about. While he climbed the ladder at Adelaide Consulting Group, calling himself a rising star at dinner parties, bragging about his corner office and his bonus structure, you sat quietly at home, running the numbers, behind 3 shell companies that eventually swallowed that entire firm whole. Nobody at that company knows your face. They know you as V. Marlowe, a name on paperwork, a signature on acquisition documents, a ghost who owns 40% of the business that pays your husband's salary. He never asked where the money for the house came from. He never asked why you insisted on keeping your maiden name on certain documents for tax purposes. He never asked because he never really looked at you long enough to wonder. That morning, the sun came through the kitchen window in thin, tired strips the way it does in late autumn, and you stood there with a coffee cup going cold in your hands, staring at that receipt. A necklace, 18-karat gold, sapphire pendant, $4,000 purchased 11 days ago. You didn't wear sapphires. You'd told him once years ago that sapphires reminded you of your mother's funeral, and he'd nodded like he was listening. Your hands didn't shake. That surprised you. You expected shaking. Instead, there was a stillness, a cold and clarifying stillness, like the moment right before a diagnosis, when the doctor's face tells you everything before the words do. You didn't confront him that night. You didn't confront him the next night either. Instead, you did what you always did when something threatened the architecture of your life. You gathered information, quietly, patiently, like laying bricks. It took you 4 days to learn her name. Odessa Faircloth, 31 years old, junior account executive at Adelaide Consulting Group, hired 8 months ago, reporting 2 levels below your husband, though apparently that hierarchy hadn't stopped much of anything. You found her on the company directory, a directory you technically had access to as a silent majority shareholder, though you'd never once used that access for anything personal. Her photo showed a woman with dark, glossy hair and an expression that looked rehearsed, like she'd practiced looking effortless in the mirror that morning. You found the messages 3 days after that, not because you're a woman who snoops. You'd never once checked his phone in 26 years, but because he left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he went to shower, and grief, or maybe instinct, walked your fingers across that keyboard before your mind gave permission. The messages were not poetic. They were not even particularly clever. They were mundane in a way that hurt worse than passion would have. Grabbing lunch today? Missed you this weekend. Can't stop thinking about Saturday. Little hearts, little kissing emojis. The banality of it made your stomach turn in a way that pure betrayal alone might not have. This wasn't a man swept away by some overwhelming, uncontrollable love. This was a man bored with his life, filling the boredom with someone 27 years younger, someone who probably thought his family money came from generations of shrewd real estate deals, the story he liked to tell at parties. He didn't know that story was a lie he'd built on your foundation. You closed the laptop gently. You did not slam it. You did not cry, not yet. You went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bathtub, and allowed yourself exactly 6 minutes of silent, shoulder-shaking grief timed on your phone, because you are a woman who does not let herself drown, even in moments that deserve drowning. Then you dried your face and you began to plan. You didn't want revenge, not exactly. Revenge is loud, and you have never been a loud woman. What you wanted was clarity, for him and for yourself. What you wanted was for the truth of the situation to arrange itself so plainly that there could be no more hiding, no more small lies stacking into an entire architecture of deception. You called your attorney, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Winifred Castellane, who had handled your business affairs for over a decade and knew more about your life than your own husband did. You told her everything. She listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when you finished, she said only one thing. You've been protecting him from the truth about your own success for over 20 years, Verity. Maybe it's time the truth protected you instead. You thought about that sentence for 3 days. Adelaide Consulting Group was preparing for its quarterly board meeting, the kind of meeting where department heads present projections, where junior executives try to catch the eye of senior partners, where your husband, in his tailored navy suit, always sat 2 seats down from the head of the table, believing himself important. You had never attended one of these meetings in person. Your involvement had always existed on paper, behind lawyers, behind the polished anonymity that Winifred had helped you construct specifically so that your marriage would never feel like a business transaction, so that Roscoe could believe he'd built his career purely on merit. You requested, for the first time in the company's history, to attend in person. The board members were surprised, then flustered, then deeply, carefully polite, the way people become when they realize the quiet name on the paperwork is now a woman sitting in the room with them watching. You wore navy, not because it matched your husband's suit, though it did, but because navy has always made you feel like steel wrapped in silk, and that morning you needed to feel exactly like that. Roscoe didn't look up when you walked in. He was reviewing his notes, adjusting his cufflinks, laughing at something one of the junior partners said, and then Odessa Faircloth walked in behind you, carrying a tray of coffee for the executives. Still low enough on the ladder to be doing that kind of task, and you watched your husband's eyes flick toward her for exactly 1.5 seconds too long. Nobody else in that room noticed. You noticed everything. You sat down at the head of the table, in the chair reserved for the majority shareholder, a chair that had remained symbolically empty for years because you had never claimed it. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when hierarchy shifts without warning. "Good morning," you said, your voice even, warm, terrifyingly calm. "I'm Verity Marlowe. Some of you may know me by a different name at home." You watched your husband's face change in real time. First confusion, then a flicker of recognition, like a word on the tip of his tongue. Then, as the room's collective gaze swiveled toward him, understanding arrived like a slow-moving train, crushing everything in its path. "Verity," he said, standing halfway out of his chair. What are you doing here?" "I own 41% of this company, Roscoe," you said, and the words landed exactly as heavy as you intended them to. "I have for 6 years, since before you were even promoted to your current position." The silence that followed had weight to it, texture, the kind of silence you could have cut into pieces and served on a plate. That's not possible," he said, and you almost laughed because of course it was possible. It had been possible for years. He simply had never asked the right questions. "It's very possible," Winifred said from her seat near the window, her voice cutting through the room like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Mrs. Marlowe has been a controlling shareholder in this firm's parent holding company since the acquisition 6 years ago. Her identity was kept confidential per her own request, for personal reasons." You watched Odessa Faircloth, still standing frozen by the coffee tray near the door, her face draining of color as the math of her own recklessness assembled itself behind her eyes. She had been sleeping with a married man. She now understood that the wife was not some background figure to be dismissed, some aging housewife easily outshined. The wife controlled the building she stood in. The salary that paid for the sapphire necklace currently hidden, you assumed in the back of some drawer in an apartment you now also, technically through several layers of holding structures, had partial claim to, since the company subsidized junior employee housing stipends. The universe has a strange, poetic sense of irony sometimes. You almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I'd like the room, please," you said. "Except for my husband." They filed out slowly, unable to look away, the way people can't look away from a car accident, even as they walk past it. Odessa hesitated at the door, glancing back once. And you met her eyes without malice. Only a tired, ancient kind of pity. The pity you feel for someone who mistook a married man's attention for something rare and special, not realizing they were simply the newest entry in a pattern that had likely repeated before. When the door closed, it was just you and Roscoe, the man you had loved since you were 32 years old, the man whose student loans you'd paid off in secret during the early years of your marriage, the man you'd sat beside during his father's funeral, holding his hand while he wept, the man who had built an entire mythology around his own success while, standing on a foundation, you had poured with your own 2 hands. "How long?" he asked quietly. 6 years with the company," you said. 22 years building the money that made it possible. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I mean, how long have you known?" "About her?" 11 days, you said. I found the receipt. He sat down heavily, running both hands through his hair, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. You watched him deflate in that chair, watched 26 years of comfortable assumptions collapse in on themselves. "I don't even know what to say to you," he finally managed. "You could start with the truth," you said. For once, he told you things you already knew. The affair had been going on for 5 months. It started at a company retreat. He claimed it meant nothing, which is the particular lie men tell themselves when they want absolution without accountability. He told you he felt invisible at home, that you'd grown distant over the years, that he didn't feel like you saw him anymore. "I didn't see you," you said, and your voice cracked slightly for the first time. "Because I was too busy building the entire floor you're standing on. I didn't see you because I spent years making sure you never had to worry about money, about failure, about anything, so that you could feel like a success without ever once wondering how deep that success actually went. You should have told me," he said, "about the company, about everything. And you should have told me you felt invisible," you said, instead of finding a 28-year-old to make you feel visible again. The silence between those two sentences held an entire marriage's worth of unspoken grievances. You didn't yell. You didn't cry again, not in front of him. You told him, with the same calm precision you'd used your whole life to build spreadsheets and closing arguments and quiet fortunes, that you were filing for divorce, that Winifred would handle everything, that his position at the company, a position he had until 11 minutes ago believed he'd earned purely through his own brilliance, would be formally reviewed by the board, separate from your personal proceedings, because you refused to let your private pain become an excuse to abuse your professional power. "You're really going to do this," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I already did it," you said, the moment you decided a sapphire necklace was worth more than honesty. You stood up, smoothed the front of your navy dress, and walked toward the door. Before you opened it, you turned back one final time. "For 22 years, I made you look bigger than you were," you said. "I'm done doing that now. Let's see how tall you stand on your own." You walked out of that boardroom, into a hallway full of employees who now understood exactly who you were, exactly what you controlled, exactly how thoroughly the ground had shifted beneath their careful office politics. You did not look back at Odessa, who stood frozen near the elevator, mascara slightly smudged, clutching her phone like it might offer her some kind of escape route. You did not need to look back. You had already won something far more important than a confrontation. You had reclaimed your own story. The following months unfolded with a strange, quiet dignity you hadn't expected. The divorce proceedings were swift, cleaner than you imagined they could be, largely because Winifred was terrifyingly thorough and Roscoe, humbled and exposed, chose not to fight the parts that mattered most. The house stayed with you, the accounts remained largely untouched because they had, after all, always technically been yours. He moved into a modest apartment across town. You heard secondhand that things with Odessa fizzled within a month of the scandal breaking, because whatever fantasy she'd built around him collapsed the moment she realized he wasn't the powerful executive she thought, but a man who'd been quietly, financially dependent on his own wife for over 2 decades. You threw yourself back into the business, not out of spite, but out of a rediscovered joy, the joy of building something entirely yours, without needing to shrink it to fit inside someone else's ego. You began attending board meetings regularly. You started mentoring young women in the company, particularly the ones just starting their careers, teaching them the quiet architecture of financial independence that nobody had ever taught you. You told them more than once that the most dangerous thing a woman can do is build an empire and then hide inside her own house, afraid to claim the throne she built with her own hands. Roscoe eventually left the company altogether. Whether out of shame or practicality, you never asked. You heard he took a position at a smaller firm across the state, somewhere he could start over, without the weight of everyone, knowing exactly how his marriage had ended, exactly how small he'd been, made to feel by the truth walking into a boardroom in a navy dress. You, on the other hand, expanded. Adelaide Consulting Group grew under new leadership you helped select personally, leadership built on transparency instead of the quiet lies that had rotted your marriage from the inside for years. You bought a small house near the coast, nothing extravagant, just enough space for morning coffee on a porch that faced the water, enough quiet for the kind of healing that doesn't happen overnight, but happens slowly, the way tides reshape a shoreline grain by grain. Sometimes on those mornings, you thought about the version of Yourself that had stood in the kitchen, holding that receipt, hands surprisingly steady, heart quietly breaking. You thought about how easy it would have been to stay quiet forever, to let him keep believing the myth of his own greatness, to keep shrinking yourself into the background of a life you had actually built. You thought about how many women do exactly that, build empires in silence, then apologize for the space they take up in their own success stories. You promised yourself you would never do that again. A year after the divorce was finalized, you received an email from Odessa Faircloth. Just 3 lines. She apologized, said she hadn't known about the marriage's real dynamics, said she hoped you'd found peace. You didn't respond right away. When you finally did, weeks later, you wrote back only 1 sentence. I hope you learn to build something of your own. Instead of borrowing someone else's shine. You never heard from her again. And you never needed to. You still think sometimes about that morning in the kitchen, the cold coffee, the folded receipt, the particular quality of light through the window. You think about how a single small piece of paper unraveled. 26 years of careful, quiet lies, and how, underneath all that unraveling, you found something you hadn't realized you'd lost. Yourself, standing fully visible finally, in the very empire you had built with your own 2 hands all along. Because the truth is, you were never the woman standing quietly in someone else's shadow. You were the foundation the entire building stood on, and the moment you stepped into the light, nobody in that room could ever again mistake you for anything less than exactly who. You'd always been the owner, not the afterthought, the architect, not the accessory. Some marriages end in fire, loud and consuming, burning everything down to ash. Yours ended in something quieter, something colder and clearer, like glass catching sunlight for the very first time. And in that clarity, you didn't just find the truth about your husband, or the truth about the woman who thought she could take something that was never really his to give away. You found the truth about yourself, and that truth, it turns out, was worth far more than any sapphire necklace, any stolen Saturday, any lie dressed up as love. That truth was worth an entire empire, one you'd built, brick by careful brick, long before anyone else in that boardroom ever thought to ask your name.